I'm David Gurevich, and I'm going to speak about Jerusalem and Mecca, New Perspectives on Archaeology of Pilgrimage. So, an overview. First, I'm going to speak about how we can identify pilgrimage in archaeology. Then I'm going to move to Jerusalem of the late Second Temple period, which means from the 2nd century before Common Era till the 1st century of Common Era. Then going to jump to Mecca of the pre-modern time, 19th century, and eventually we get to analysis, discussion, and conclusions. So let's go. Pilgrimage in archaeology. Recently, Kit Wessler published a book, An Archaeology of Religion, and in that book, after he did a review of different religions and how we can identify them in archaeology, he also discusses pilgrimage. And I would like to quote a few sentences that will be a starting point for our discussion. He writes, "Pilgrimage cost-cuts almost all of the religions and cultural boundaries discussed in previous chapters. Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism all have clear traditions of pilgrimage. Yet, archaeologists have not been constantly definitive in their explanations of evidence for identifying pilgrimage centers." So the question is, when we come to a site, as archaeologists who come after several hundreds of years or after several thousands of years, how we can identify that this site was a pilgrimage center or a pilgrimage destination. So I would like to show you one example. This is the Jordan River in Israel, and what you can see here are Christian pilgrims committing a baptism. Now, you can see the robes, but you can see them today when the rite is happening, but after thousands of years, you'll not find them on site. So when you come to this site, after thousands of years, what will signal you that this site was the site of a pilgrimage? That's a question. Another interesting issue. So this is a picture from a site called Mina near Mecca that people who commit Hajj stay here for some time. Now, what you can see here are tents that use for temporal housing of the pilgrims. Now, the question is what we'll see if we come here after several hundreds of years. Tents will not be here, they will not survive. They will be not left on the site, and if they left, probably it will be consumed. So how we can identify that this specific location was a pilgrimage center? And when we discuss today on the research that's already made, we can basically divide the evidence for pilgrimage centers into two possible types. So the first one is the obvious evidence. For instance, you can see here pilgrim souvenirs from today Jerusalem, a cross, a piece of a Holy Land, something that is obviously connected to pilgrimage. People who commit pilgrimage come there, they want to purchase these materials, they want to have these materials, and so on. The other thing that I would suggest is to look on anomaly. Something weird about the site that should be explained, and that can testify for pilgrimage. For instance, foreign coins that were found in Jerusalem on the 1st century of Common Era. So what you see here are tetradrachm. These coins were used as a special tax that people brought to the temple. Now, the fact that we have these coins in Jerusalem, and they're not originally from Jerusalem, and in big quantities, it's an anomaly. It's not supposed to be. So we should look forward into the site and look deeper in order to find an answer. Another interesting example is research made by several scholars named, the title was Holy Garbage. So what they did, they checked the city dump of Jerusalem of the late Second Temple period, and they made a quantitative analysis of it. So that's how it looked like. You can see the dump. You can see here Professor Ronnie Reich standing near a cut in the dump. And when they processed the composition of the dump, what they found that in terms of archaeological assemblage, there is a very high percentage of sheep and goat bones, and most of the sheep and goats were immature. So this is something very weird. Again, an anomaly. The scholars explained it that these bones were part of a sacrifice that were brought to the temple, and because people wanted to bring young sheep and young goats, we have bigger amount of this in the city dump. So let's go forward into Jerusalem and speak about one interesting phenomenon that I discovered. 2nd century from before Common Era until 70 of Common Era, when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. So for you who don't have in mind the map, here's the map of the region. Jerusalem is located on top of the mountains. So a lot of people assume that Jerusalem is desert, but actually Jerusalem is not in the desert. We have about 550 millimeters of rain, 21.5 inches a year, which is quite significant. But still, this is not the same as, for instance, being in a very rainy area in the US or in New Zealand, you name it. So still have lack of water. Now, in the ancient time, Jerusalem was considered as one of the most famous cities of the East, and the reason for that is the international pilgrimage. International pilgrimage, which came to its peak during the 1st century of Common Era. On the other hand, the estimation of population, permanent population of the city, is about between 15,000 to 30,000. Depends on different researchers. There is, of course, a methodological challenge in making these estimations, but this was definitely not the biggest city in the ancient world, and even not in the East when we speak about sizes, dimensions, and amount of population. So what made it so famous? And the reason is pilgrimage. So Jews used to come to Jerusalem for pilgrimage of the 3 festivals of pilgrimage: Passover, Feast of the Weeks, Shavuot, and Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot. And during that time, tens of thousands of pilgrims visited the city for short periods. Now that means that during that time, amount of people staying on site increased significantly. It could be doubled, it could be tripled. This is the map of Jerusalem, and the first thing that we have to see, this map is made by a proposition of Danny Batt. You can see that this wall, the third wall, did not exist before, or it was built just shortly before Jerusalem was destroyed. So most of the period that we are discussing, this wall didn't exist. And what you can immediately see on this map, that we have a lot of unroofed water pools. So I marked here 9 water pools. About 7 of them we have an evidence they could exist during the Second Temple period. 2 of the other pools, 2 of them are simply not dated. So they could exist, maybe they are later, we don't know, but for the discussion we do regard them as pools that existed during the Second Temple period. So just to give you a bit of understanding what this pool is about, the biggest pool, Birkat Israel, has significant dimensions. You can see over here 110 on 38 meters, 24 meters depth. But the other pools also were not small installations. For instance, pool of Hezekiah, 94 on 44 meters, and so on. And when we start to summarize what we know about the pools, we'll see that there are a few interesting points. First of all, most of these pools used to collect runoff water, meaning these pools were usually constructed in valleys, and they used to catch water running in the valley that otherwise would be lost. 7 of the pools were located outside the city boundaries. And again, I remind you that the third wall didn't exist. And this is definitely an anomaly, because there is no other city in the Roman East with so many unroofed water pools. And the question is what it is doing here. So Gurevich, for instance, checked about 40 different sites in the Roman Near East, and usually you can find, if there is a pool, you can find 1 pool in the city, but not 7. And even more weird in this situation is that the city had other water sources. So there were aqueducts, there is a spring, people had underground reservoirs, cisterns under their houses, there were underground reservoirs under the Temple Mount, and the question is what these pools are doing here. So the first thing I tried to do is to compare these pools to what we have in the Roman world. And we do have examples of open pools in the Roman world. Of course, the most prominent example is a swimming pool, natatio, in a bathhouse. Now, pools in Jerusalem are not connected to the bathhouses, and they also much larger dimensions. There are some decorative pools, but these usually based in the center of the cities, so monumental buildings could reflect in the pool and make a visual effect. When Romans used to store water, they usually did it in underground reservoirs or reservoirs with roof. So again, it doesn't match. And some pools in the Roman world were used for a reproduction of fish, but again, these were small pools usually if they were built in the city, and they look totally different way. So the question is, what the pools are doing in Jerusalem. Definitely they are not the same or not similar to what we have in the Roman world. One interesting parallel that is quite obvious when you look on the archaeology of Jerusalem is a parallel to mikvaot, the Jewish ritual baths. So you can see here how a typical mikveh, a ritual bath, look like, and pay attention to the stairs. So you have broad steps that separate group of narrow stairs, and we can see in 2 pools out of our corpus that we have the same situation. So the scholars actually did suggest for these 2 pools, for Pool of Siloam and the Southern Pool of St. Anna Church compound, that these were used for purity. But again, what's going on with the other pools, and why do we need them if we have mikvaot? So, to summarize middle one at this point, the phenomena is unique to Jerusalem. Jerusalem pools were not in context of private mansions or palaces. Absence of public bathhouses in Jerusalem, so that could not be swimming pools. Absence of pipes or urban water distribution systems, so they could not be used as part of a Roman water system, Roman style water system, and many of these pools are of considerable dimensions. I'm leaving Jerusalem for a second. I would like to go to Mecca, Mecca of the early 19th century. Why I'm going to Mecca of the early 19th century? So when I did my research, I tried to find sites that would be parallel, that have similar conditions to Jerusalem as sites of pilgrimage. And that was not an easy task, because, for instance, you need a site with a similar climate, so you have lack of water. You need also a site that will have pilgrimage, but you also need a site that will not have a constant water source. So, for instance, say if you check Olympia, in Olympia there is a river nearby, so it doesn't really work. And that's how I got to Mecca of the early 19th century. So Mecca is located in the Arabian desert. You can see it here. And the average rainfall is 110 millimeters, which is much less in Jerusalem. This is actually a desert. And Mecca is known as, of course, the destination of the Muslim pilgrimage, the Hajj. Each Muslim has to go to Mecca once in his life. Now, what is interesting about Hajj is that people need to get there on specific dates each year, 5 days that you spend in Mecca and on sites near Mecca. And only on these dates, your journey will be considered as the Hajj. If you come outside these dates, it will not be considered as a Hajj, so it will not work for you. You can come, it will be considered as a visit, but not as a Hajj. So in Mecca, we do have limited water sources, dry climate. On the other hand, starting from the 9th century, there is an aqueduct, Aqueduct Zubaydah, that supplied the city with water. Now, the reason why I went to the 19th century, early 19th century, because this was before the introduction of modern technologies that changed the water supply significantly. For instance, today Mecca receives its water from desalination facilities. But of course, in the early 19th century, the supply was almost the same as they used hundreds of or thousands of years before that. Pilgrims were 50 to 80,000 people annually, while permanent population was 35,000 people. So what you can see is that amount of pilgrims coming to the site was significantly higher than the amount of the population. Now, we know that pilgrims cross the desert together in organized groups called caravans that started from different countries: Egypt, Syria, Yemen, Iraq. And they all traveled together, and when they arrived to Mecca, they also camped together. Now, when I started to look for archaeological data on Mecca, I discovered that I have a challenge. The challenge is that we do not have archaeological reports from Mecca. The reason for that is basically a political and religious reason. The Saudi authorities do not want people to investigate archaeology of Mecca because they do not want people to worship sites that are not mentioned in the Quran. But when I do not have data, I have to be creative. And what I did, I found travelogues of travelers of the early 19th century who disguised themselves as Muslims and infiltrated into Mecca. Some of them, by the way, like Ali Bey, were spies that went into Mecca and gave us account of how the city looked like, what were the streets, they draw maps, and this is a very precious information today. So one source is Ali Bey, another very important source is Bukhart, a traveler who actually discovered Petra, but he also went to Mecca, disguised as Muslim, and gave us a very interesting description. So this is a map made by Bukhart, and you can see that this is the city here in the center, and what you can see here is that outside the city we have 3 pools. And what is even more interesting are the names of the pools. Pay attention: Birkat el-Masri, the pool of the Egyptians, or Birkat el-Shami, the pool of the Syrians. And we know that these pools are connected to the sites where the caravans used to park. So it cannot be a coincidence. Now, this is a photograph, this is a lithograph made by Ali Bey from a site near Mount Arafat. And you can see again, there are 3 pools here. And by the way, in his travelogue, he describes there are much more pools over there. So, let's go to finalize discussion. The entire economic structure of the 2 cities depended on seasonal pilgrimage. both cities were in shortage of water during the pilgrimage holidays when people arrived, and you couldn't simply open the tap of the aqueduct more. The aqueduct had a limited supply, and during the time that the pilgrims arrived to the city, much more water was needed. So in Mecca, we hear that there was a special office installed called Office of Sikaya, when a very respected person was appointed to supply water to the pilgrims. In Jerusalem, the same. The temple authorities had to provide water, and we hear it from rabbinical sources. Now, what is obvious that the amount of available drinking water determines the amount of pilgrims. In other words, if you cannot supply the water, people will not be able to stay on the site. And today, in Mecca, when they do not have any limits, and they use desalination facilities, we have about 2 million of pilgrims coming to the year annually. That's amazing. Now, the water was used for drinking needs of the pilgrims, of course, sacrificial animals, and ritual purity, at least in the case of Jerusalem. Now, names of the pools in Mecca testify to a use by pilgrim caravans. So, Birkat al-Masri, Egyptian pool, Syrian pool, and so on. Now, have a look on the map. This is the map of Mecca, and you can see that the pools are located outside the city. And it's obvious that the pilgrims, when they arrived to the city, they stayed, if they pitched their tents, they had to do it outside the built-up area. And the same story in Jerusalem. Again, pay attention that we don't have this road wall. And if you look on the sites where we have pilgrims, that would be here, near the pools. And we have actually testimony of Josephus that pilgrims used to stay in these areas. So, I'm finishing up. Conclusions. The pools were intended to store water as preparation for the arrival of masses of pilgrims. So they had to do it in advance in order to prepare for the time when the pilgrims are in the city and the water demand is rising. Water sources of the pools in Jerusalem, primary runoff water. So if we did not have these pools, the water would be lost. In Mecca, that was an aqueduct. The pools are located near the parking sites of the pilgrims in both cases. And what is, as conclusion from that, is that the pools must have been constructed for pilgrims' needs. Water storages, purity, and so on. And my final conclusion, I think we can speak about a broader scale. So we started with how we can identify pilgrimage sites. In the past, stress was laid on the research of small finds that testify to the pilgrimage activities, such as cultic artifacts, foreign coins, pottery vessels, or animal bones from the city dump, and so on. I suggest that the existence of unroofed water pools is actually an outstanding manifestation of pilgrimage activity that can be expected to be found in the material culture of pilgrimage centers. So it doesn't mean that each pilgrimage center would have unroofed pools, but if you do have the pools, this is the anomaly that might suggest that this site was a pilgrimage center. Thank you very much.